Before we start, I just want to say something. You already know this story. At least you think you do. Someone burned it. The books are gone. Humanity was set back 1,000 years. It's one of those facts that lives in the back of your mind, heavy and certain. Like a stone you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing the weight. I'm going to ask you to put it down for a minute. Just set it on the floor. Because what actually happened, what really happened, is so much stranger, so much more human, and honestly, so much sadder than the tidy catastrophe we were sold. This is the real story of the Library of Alexandria, and I promise you, it's worth the trip. Let's start at the beginning, because even the beginning gets misunderstood. Most people picture the Library of Alexandria as a building. A grand hall, probably with columns, scrolls stacked floor to ceiling, scholars shuffling around in sandals, and sure, there was probably something like that. But the library wasn't really a building. It was an idea, and the idea was insane for its time. Genuinely, boundary-breakingly insane. The idea was this. What if you collected all human knowledge in one place? Not just Greek knowledge. Not just the knowledge your civilization happened to produce. All of it. Every scroll, every text, every poem, every medical manual, every star chart, from every culture that had ever written anything down. What if you pulled all of that into one city, and then you hired the smartest people alive to read it, argue about it, cross-reference it, and produce new knowledge on top of it? That was the Mouseion, the House of the Muses, and the library was its heart. It was founded around 295 BCE by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals who had inherited Egypt after Alexander died. Ptolemy was a Macedonian Greek ruling over Egyptians, and he had a political problem that all conquerors have: legitimacy. How do you make a foreign people accept you? Ptolemy's answer was breathtaking in its ambition. He would make Alexandria the intellectual capital of the known world. He would make it the place where human civilization thought. He brought in a man named Demetrius of Phalerum, a student of Aristotle, exiled from Athens, to design the thing. And Demetrius was the right person for the job, because Demetrius didn't think small. He didn't want a nice library. He wanted something that had never existed before. The scholars who came to work there were essentially kept by the state. They didn't pay taxes. They had free food, free accommodation, and a salary. Their only job was to think. They had access to the greatest collection of scrolls in the world. They had each other, and they had time. For a scholar in the ancient world, this was paradise. It was an offer you didn't refuse. And they came. They came from everywhere. Euclid worked out the foundations of geometry there. Eratosthenes, working around 240 BCE, calculated the circumference of the Earth. Not roughly, not in the right ballpark. He was accurate to within a couple of % of the real number, using nothing but a well, a stick, and the angle of the sun's shadow. Archimedes, who may have studied there, gave us the lever, the screw, the foundations of calculus, 20 centuries before Newton. Herophilus performed the first systematic human dissections there and mapped the nervous system. Aristarchus proposed, right there in Alexandria, that the Earth orbits the Sun, not the other way around. 17 centuries before Copernicus would be credited with the same idea. The library wasn't just a place where books were kept. It was a machine for producing the future. Here's the part of the story that most people don't know, and it says everything about what Alexandria really was. Ptolemy III, the grandson of the founder, who ruled around 246 BCE, was passionate about the library in a way that had become almost pathological. He wanted every scroll, every single one, and he had a strategy for getting them that was, depending on how you look at it, either brilliant or absolutely shameless. When ships sailed into Alexandria's harbour, one of the busiest ports in the ancient world, Ptolemy's officials would board them and ask a simple question. Do you have any books on board? If the answer was yes, the books were taken. They were brought to the library, copied by professional scribes onto fresh papyrus, and then, here's the key detail. The original was kept, and the copy was given back to the sailors. The library would actually stamp these copies from the ships. They knew they were getting the better end of the deal. They didn't care. Ptolemy also borrowed the official state copies of the great Athenian playwrights, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, supposedly for copying purposes. Athens required a substantial deposit, which Ptolemy paid. Then he kept the originals, forfeited the deposit, and sent back beautiful copies. He reportedly considered it money well spent. By its peak, probably somewhere in the 1st century BCE, the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. And here's what a scroll actually is. It's not a book. A single scroll typically held maybe 30 to 40 pages of modern text. So 700,000 scrolls might represent something like 100,000 full-length books, which is a fraction of what a modern university library holds. But remember, this was every book that existed. This was essentially the entire written record of human civilization to that point. There was also, at some point, a daughter library attached to the Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, across the city. Whether this was a branch of the main library or a separate institution is a matter of scholarly debate, but it held tens of thousands of scrolls in its own right. So when we talk about losing the Library of Alexandria, we're talking about losing that. The almost complete record of what humans had figured out, thought, written, sung, proved, and dreamed up over the previous several centuries. No wonder the story haunts us. Now, the fire. Julius Caesar, 48 BCE. You've heard this one. Caesar is in Alexandria, caught up in a war, and he sets fire to the ships in the harbour to prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him. The fire spreads to the waterfront, and the library burns, and everything is lost. And Caesar, brilliant, ruthless, careless Caesar, wipes out the collected knowledge of the ancient world in one afternoon. It's a great story. It has a villain, a catastrophe, a specific date. It's the kind of story history loves. It's also almost certainly not what happened. The problem is the sources. The most vivid description of the fire comes from Plutarch, writing over 100 years after the fact. Other ancient writers who were actually in Alexandria around this time, including Strabo, one of the greatest geographers of antiquity, who visited the city just 2 decades after Caesar's campaign, described the Mouseion and its scholarly community as still thriving, still operating. If the library had been catastrophically destroyed, Strabo would have had quite a lot to say about it. He didn't. What most historians now believe is that Caesar's fire burned warehouses near the harbour, possibly warehouses that held books awaiting export, which is genuinely a loss, but that the main library itself survived. Caesar also seems to have sent a gift afterward, tens of thousands of scrolls from Pergamon, possibly as compensation. Mark Antony later gave Cleopatra, whose city this was, another enormous collection of books from Pergamon. The library was not dead, it was still being nourished. So, if not Caesar, then who? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely uncomfortable. Here's the truth that the dramatic fire story obscures. The Library of Alexandria didn't end on a particular afternoon. It faded. It was worn away. It declined through a combination of violence, neglect, political indifference, and the slow grinding attrition of time, across centuries, not a single catastrophic afternoon. The Roman period was already troubled for Alexandria. The city was conquered by Augustus Caesar in 30 BCE, after the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. Egypt became a Roman province, and the Mouseion continued. The Romans valued it, used it, funded it. But it was no longer the center of a living civilization. It was an inheritance, a museum of someone else's golden age. And museums, as any curator will tell you, require constant investment to survive. When the investment wavers, things deteriorate quietly. There were real episodes of physical destruction, though. Around 270 CE, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra briefly seized Alexandria. When the Roman Emperor Aurelian retook the city, his forces destroyed the Brucheion, the royal quarter of the city where the main library was believed to be located. How much of the library survived this, we don't know. Probably some. Probably not all. Then there was 391 CE. This is the event that many modern historians consider the most significant single blow to what remained of the library. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I had declared Christianity the official religion of the empire, and Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria was given authority to purify the city of its pagan institutions. What happened next was ugly. A Christian mob, with apparent backing from Theophilus, destroyed the Serapeum, the great temple complex that housed the daughter library. Ancient sources describe significant destruction. Books almost certainly burned. Pagan scholars were driven out. The philosopher Hypatia, a mathematician and astronomer, one of the last great Alexandrian scholars, was murdered by a mob in 415 CE. Her flesh reportedly scraped from her bones with oyster shells. Her death is often used, somewhat symbolically, as a marker for the end of Alexandria's intellectual tradition. But even then, even after the Serapeum, there were scholars still working in Alexandria. The tradition didn't snap, it frayed. And then there's the final villain in the popular telling, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As, who conquered Alexandria in 642 CE. According to a story that circulated in the 12th century, written by a Christian bishop named Bar Hebraeus, citing an earlier source, the Caliph Omar was asked what to do with the library. Omar reportedly replied, "If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, they are useless and need not be preserved. If they disagree, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed." The books, the story goes, were distributed to the public baths of Alexandria, where they were burned as fuel. It took, allegedly, 6 months for all of them to be consumed. This story was taken seriously for centuries. It's still repeated today. There's just one problem. It almost certainly didn't happen. The story appears in no Arab source from anywhere near the time of the conquest. The earliest telling is from a Christian bishop writing almost 600 years after the supposed event. Modern historians treat it as propaganda, a piece of anti-Islamic polemic circulating during the Crusades, designed to blame a political and religious enemy for a loss that had actually accumulated over centuries of Christian rule. The famous classical scholar Edward Gibbon was skeptical of it. The great Arab scholar Ibn al-Nadim, writing in the 10th century, compiled the most comprehensive bibliography of the ancient world he could find without any sense that the library had been destroyed by his co-religionists. The story doesn't hold up. The harder, more honest truth is this. By the time the Arab armies arrived in Alexandria in 642 CE, there almost certainly wasn't much of a library left to burn. Whatever had survived the centuries of decline, the Roman neglect, the sack of the Brucheion, the destruction of the Serapeum, the departure of the scholars, it had already been reduced to fragments, not by one villain, not on one afternoon, but by time, by circumstance, by the ordinary violence of history. This is the part that keeps historians up at night. We don't actually know what was in the library. We have titles, we have references, ancient authors quoting or mentioning works that no longer exist. We have fragments, sometimes tantalizing, sometimes heartbreaking. And from these traces, we can begin to sketch the silhouette of what's gone. We know that Aristotle wrote around 200 works. We have 31. The rest, including most of his dialogues, which ancient readers apparently considered his finest writing, are lost. We have 7 plays by Aeschylus, 7 by Sophocles, 19 by Euripides. The ancients had access to dozens by each of them. We have what survived the Alexandrian cataloguing process, what the scholars there considered most worth preserving. We don't have what didn't make the cut. We know that Eratosthenes wrote treatises on geography, mathematics, philosophy, and poetry. Almost none of it survives. We know that Hero of Alexandria described machines, a rudimentary steam-powered device, geared mechanical systems that would not be reinvented for over 1,000 years. We have fragments. We have summaries. There is a text called the Antikythera mechanism. Not a text at all, actually, but a device recovered from an ancient shipwreck, a mechanical computer that could predict astronomical events, eclipse cycles, the positions of the planets. It dates to around 100 BCE. It is so sophisticated that for decades after its discovery, scholars didn't believe it was real. And the extraordinary thing about the Antikythera mechanism is this: we have no ancient text that describes how to build it. Whatever tradition produced it, whatever body of knowledge made it possible, is gone. We found the artifact. The knowledge behind it didn't survive. That's what it means to lose a library. Not just the books, the thinking behind the books. The accumulated practice of generations of people working at the absolute frontier of what was knowable. There's one more layer to this that almost never gets talked about, and it matters. Papyrus doesn't last. In dry Egyptian conditions, buried under the desert sand, sealed in a tomb, papyrus can survive for thousands of years. We have Egyptian texts from 3000 BCE that are still readable. But in a city, in a humid Mediterranean port city, with flooding and salt air and the inevitable casualties of daily life, papyrus lasts at best a few hundred years before it degrades beyond use. This means that even if no one had ever touched the library in violence, even if Caesar's ships had burned different ships, even if Theophilus had turned his mobs elsewhere, even if the Arab conquest had never happened, the library would still have required constant, expensive, devoted maintenance just to exist. The scrolls would need to be copied regularly onto fresh papyrus. The collection would need to be actively managed, curated, reproduced. This is the boring answer that the fire story drowns out. Libraries die when people stop caring enough to maintain them. The Library of Alexandria was an institution sustained by political will and public investment. When the political will wavered, when the funding dried up, when the scholars left or were killed or found patronage elsewhere, the physical collection would have begun to deteriorate on its own. Silently, without drama, without fire. The library wasn't destroyed. It was not saved. There's a difference, and it's important. So here we are. The Library of Alexandria wasn't burned by Caesar, or not only by Caesar, and not really in the way we think. It wasn't destroyed by Theophilus, though he did real damage. It wasn't burned by the Arabs, despite what a 12th century bishop claimed. It faded. It was chipped at by centuries of violence and indifference, and the biological fragility of papyrus, and the ordinary entropy of institutions that outlive the passion that created them. That's a less satisfying story than a single villain and a single fire. I know that. We are wired for stories with clear causes and clear catastrophes. We want to point at the moment it went wrong, and we want to know who to blame. But the real story is both more tragic and more useful. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed by a failure of sustained collective will. It was destroyed because each generation that inherited it cared about it a little less than the generation before, because political priorities shifted, because the money that had funded it got spent elsewhere, because the scholars who might have saved it were driven away or killed, or simply found there was no longer a place for them, because nobody at any single moment made the decision to destroy it. They just, collectively, failed to make the decision to save it. And that is a story about us, about now, about every institution, every body of knowledge, every tradition of inquiry that exists today. The Library of Alexandria tells us that civilization is not a fixed state that humanity achieved and then inhabits safely. It is a practice, a daily practice, a practice of choosing, over and over, to invest in the accumulated understanding of our species, to copy the scrolls, to fund the scholars, to protect the buildings, to insist that the thinking continue. When we stop making that choice, the library doesn't burn. It just quietly ceases to be maintained. And one morning, several generations later, someone looks for it and finds that it's gone. There is a moment in the story of the library that I find almost unbearable. Sometime around 415 CE, not long before Hypatia was killed, a man named Synesius of Cyrene wrote a letter to her. He was one of her former students, a Christian bishop by then, and he wrote to tell her that he had constructed an astrolabe, a device for measuring the positions of the stars, based on her teachings. He wanted to share his work with her. He wanted her to see what her knowledge had made possible in him. Hypatia wrote back, "We don't have her letter. We have his, because he was a bishop and his letters were preserved. Hers, because she was a pagan woman, were not." That asymmetry, what got saved, what didn't, and why, is the real story of the Library of Alexandria. Not fire, not a single catastrophic afternoon, but the 10,000 small decisions across 7 centuries about whose knowledge mattered, whose work deserved to survive, who deserved a building and a salary and the freedom to think. We made those decisions then. We make them now. The library is not a thing of the past. It is a warning. It is a question, still open, still urgent, that history is asking us every single day. What are you choosing to keep?